Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about Indigenous Studies, which is technically sort of a subset of critical race studies, but I think Indigenous Studies has a major difference that makes it worthy of its own video. Because while Indigenous Studies does engage with all the same kind of stuff that critical race studies does, how are particular societies constructed along racial or ethnic lines? How are those racial and ethnic categories even conceptualized? What does it mean to be an Indigenous person in this particular society? How do Indigenous people navigate systems of inequality, etc., etc.? All of those questions that we have with critical race studies are there in Indigenous studies as well. But there's another major component that we don't have when we're dealing with something like, say, African American studies or Jewish American studies. If you're dealing with other ethnic minorities, like, for instance, the Chinese in Malaysia, or something like this. Whatever it is. Anyway, you get my point. There's another component to Indigenous studies, which is a connection to place. And this is really important for Indigenous groups like First Nations Canadians or Native Americans, Inuit, Métis, Maori, Aboriginal Australians, etc., etc. One of the things that these cultures tend to be built around is connections to particular places and particular natural resources. And so this really applies under what's called settler colonialism. So that would be in most colonial situations, right? You look at, say, the British in Nigeria or Jamaica. You look at the French in Algeria. You look at Roman imperialism. You look at the Mongol Empire. The list goes on. For the most part, what imperialists tend to do is to conquer an area and control the people to greater or lesser extents. What settler colonialism involves is basically bringing in a bunch of people from the colonizing nation to either generally replace in some way through genocide, through overpopulation, through intermarriage, whatever it is, generally to replace the native population there. So in the United States, for instance, as well as Canada, Europeans came and settled the empty continent, the unclaimed continent of North America. The problem is it was settled, it was claimed, it was the traditional territory of a wide range of Native American and First Nations peoples. The white settlers who came from Europe, the European settlers who came from Europe, either kind of said, hey, nobody's here, or Native Americans, First Nations peoples aren't really human, so it's fine if we take their territory. Or they're not using it productively, so we can take it and set up mines and factories and mass agriculture and all this good stuff that, of course, we know now has a massive detrimental environmental impact, etc., etc. So that's kind of the thing. We get the same thing in Australia. We get the same thing in New Zealand. And actually, interestingly enough, a lot of ancient Greek imperialism worked the same way. The Greeks would set up colonies. Athens would send out a settler expedition, or Corinth would, or Sparta would, or whatever it was, and they would set up a colony and they would displace the indigenous peoples. Anyway, so the thing that makes indigenous studies unique among the sort of pantheon of critical race studies subdisciplines is that indigenous studies has this deep connection to land. And there's an idea that's emerged in the past couple of decades called indigenous resurgence. And this is promoted by people like Leanne Simpson, Tayaiki Alfred, Arthur Manuel, before he died. He died, I think, in 2012, I want to say, something like that. Sean Glenn Coulthard, people like this, who are sort of major thinkers. I'm most familiar with indigenous studies in the Canadian and Native American, First Nations Canadian and Native American context. But we also have people in, again, the indigenous Aboriginal Australian communities and the Maori community in New Zealand who are working along the same lines. And there is this indigenous internationalism movement that promotes indigenous resurgence. And basically, indigenous resurgence is the idea that indigenous peoples can reestablish connections to their ancestral territories. Obviously not everything, because, I mean, as I think it's Arthur Manuel says in his book, Unsettling Canada, it's not practical to expect Canadians of European descent to just completely vacate the entire country of Canada. But there are vast swaths of unceded territory. That is, territory that the indigenous inhabitants never officially signed over, never gave up by treaty or anything like this. And so what indigenous research depends on the particular thinker, the particular practitioner, but indigenous resurgence often involves advocating some kind of reconnection to the territory that their ancestors occupied. Whether that is the more sort of militant side of, like, I don't know, the Seneca Nation wants the city of Rochester, where I grew up, to be sort of vacated and demolished, to be turned back into natural woodland or whatever. That tends to not be a very common view because there's a lot of practical problems with that, and it's not likely an achievable goal. But a lot of people, a lot of supporters of indigenous resurgence believe, at the very least, that the indigenous peoples who occupied a particular territory should have some degree of control over things like development project, anything that's going to impact natural resources in that area. Water is very, very culturally significant for a lot of indigenous groups. Particular types of animals are very, very significant. And so things like building, things like treatment of chemicals, all of these kinds of things can pose major environmental problems, which of course we know anyway. But when those those things in the environment are being impacted have a cultural or even a religious significance for particular groups. There's an argument that those groups should have some degree of say over that development or whatever it is. If you are going to log in the territory of, say, the Anishinaabe, should that nation have some say over how many trees you can cut down in their territory? If you're going to be, for instance, taking oil out of Ojibwe territory, should the Ojibwe have some say over how that is done and what sort of environmental impacts they are willing to tolerate in their ancestral homeland? And then the other component of this is often that the people whose territory has largely been stolen should get some form of compensation for the resources taken from their territory. If you are logging in a particular nation's territory, is it right that the probably white Canadian or US-owned corporation who does that logging makes all of the profit, despite the fact that that territory was never given up by that indigenous group? So this is part of it. This is the sort of practical side of indigenous resurgence. Is it reestablishing land use rights? And actually, the land use rights of indigenous peoples, in Canada at least, I believe have been held up by the Canadian Supreme Court, and then the Canadian government was just sort of like, meh, what you gonna do about it? So that's not fantastic. But then the other component of indigenous resurgence is a reestablishment of indigenous culture. And so this can take a lot of different forms. Again, part of this is about connection to particular territories, but it's also about ethical ways of being in the world. So this idea of interconnection is very, very important to a lot of indigenous cultures. This idea that humans and nature, humans and humans and animals, humans and water, humans and plants, humans and geographic features have significant practical, spiritual, and ethical relationships. That's really significant in a lot of indigenous cultures, and colonialism, capitalism, these things have alienated a lot of indigenous peoples from those traditional value systems. And so people like Leanne Simpson, people like Tyegi Alfred, these kinds of thinkers advocate a return to an ethical system in which cooperation, codependence, mutual responsibility are fundamental ethical practices. And this would involve, of course, treating other human beings more ethically and humanely, but also treating animals, treating plants, treating waterways, treating spaces with respect and concern for not just what can we as humans or a particular group of humans get out of this resource, but actually not even treating it as a resource necessarily, treating it as part of a community. So this idea of an interconnected world in which everything is dependent on one another, everything shares links, is really, really significant for indigenous resurgence. And again, these are the kinds of things, this idea of the connection to the land, the interconnected ethos, etc., etc. These are things that do make indigenous studies stand out as a distinct category within the broader umbrella of critical race studies.